In the early hours of November 1983, Soviet air defense crews on the East German border were told to expect a war, not a drill, not a simulation. A real nuclear strike from NATO, arriving within days. They were reacting to a NATO exercise, a paperwork drill 4 days long, designed only to test how alliance commanders passed messages during a crisis. Moscow did not believe that for a second. The exercise was called Able Archer 83. To the officers who ran it, it was routine, the same drill NATO had rehearsed for years. To the men reading the intercepts in Moscow, it looked like the countdown to annihilation. To understand how a training exercise nearly triggered a war, you have to go back 8 months to a speech in Orlando, Florida, where the American president gave the Soviet Union a name it would never forget. In March 1983, Ronald Reagan called the USSR an evil empire. To American audiences, it was a rhetorical flourish. To the aging men in the Kremlin, exhausted and paranoid, it read like a declaration of intent. That same year, NATO was preparing to place a new generation of missiles in Western Europe. Pershing 2 ballistic missiles capable of reaching Moscow in under 10 minutes. Soviet planners had never faced a weapon that fast. Then, on September 1st, 1983, Soviet fighters shot down a civilian airliner, Korean Airlines Flight 007, killing 269 people who had strayed into restricted Soviet airspace. The world's outrage convinced Moscow the West wanted a pretext. Leading the Soviet Union through this was Yuri Andropov, former head of the KGB, now General Secretary, gravely ill, and more convinced than any leader before him that NATO was preparing a first strike. 2 years earlier, as KGB chairman, Andropov had launched an operation with a chilling name, Ryan, an acronym for Nuclear Missile Attack. Its purpose was to detect the earliest possible warning signs of a NATO strike. Operation Ryan sent instructions to every KGB and GRU station on Earth. Watch blood banks for stockpiling. Watch government windows for late-night lights. Watch clergy for unusual activity. Any anomaly might be the first thread of a plot. It was, by later Western assessment, an almost impossible task, hunting for a war that was not actually being planned. But inside a system built on suspicion, absence of evidence was never treated as evidence of absence. So when NATO announced its annual Autumn Command exercise for November 2nd through 11th, 1983, Soviet analysts didn't see a drill. They saw the first data point Andropov had told them to look for. Able Archer had run before, every year, without incident. But NATO planners had changed the format this time, updated codes, new communication procedures, a simulated shift through every level of alert straight to nuclear release. For the first time, the exercise practiced periods of total radio silence, the exact behavior real forces would use before a genuine attack. To an outside listener, it was indistinguishable from actual war preparation. Message traffic simulated the participation of NATO heads of government and defense ministers, moving through the same channels that would carry real orders. Soviet listening posts had never seen this level of realism before. The scenario itself was designed to be worst case, a conventional war in Europe escalating to chemical weapons, then breaking down entirely into a coordinated nuclear release. It was fiction. Moscow could not be certain of that. Soviet signal intercept units monitoring the exercise flagged the changes immediately and forwarded them up the chain. In a system already primed by Operation Ryan, every deviation from the ordinary was reclassified as a warning sign. Warsaw-packed command centers moved to heightened readiness. In East Germany and Poland, Soviet air regiments were placed on alert, and by several later accounts, nuclear-capable aircraft were fitted with live warheads and held on standby. Ground crews worked through the night arming aircraft that, under any other circumstance, would have sat idle. Pilots slept in their flight suits. Nobody told them it was almost certainly a drill on the other side. Across the Soviet Union's forward air divisions, readiness climbed in step with the exercise's own simulated escalation, as if two militaries, one real and one rehearsing, had accidentally begun moving in the same direction. 400 miles away in London, a KGB colonel named Oleg Gordievsky sat inside the Soviet embassy reading the same alarmed cables from Moscow Center. Gordievsky had one secret nobody in that building knew. He worked for MI6. Gordievsky had been passing intelligence to British intelligence for years. What crossed his desk that November was unlike anything before it. Not curiosity about NATO, but genuine, escalating fear at the highest levels of Soviet intelligence. He reported what he was seeing to his British handlers, that Moscow believed, at least at some levels, that Able Archer might be the cover story for a real NATO first strike and was reacting accordingly. MI6 passed the warning to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's government, and from London it moved to Washington. What landed on American desks was a request to consider something almost unthinkable. The Soviets weren't posturing, they were afraid. Inside the CIA, the reaction was skepticism. Analysts had spent years assuming Soviet leadership understood, as American leadership did, that Able Archer was theater, a scheduling exercise, not a prelude. Surely Moscow knew the difference. That assumption was the entire danger. American planners were reasoning from their own intentions, not from how a frightened, aging Soviet leadership actually perceived the signals arriving on their desks that same week in November. Andropov himself was barely able to govern. Kidney failure had confined him to a hospital bed for much of that autumn. The man ultimately responsible for reading these warnings correctly was dying and running out of time. By November 8th and 9th, the exercise had reached its simulated peak. NATO's fictional scenario had climbed on paper to a coordinated nuclear release. Soviet monitoring stations logged the escalation as if it might be real. Some historians who later reviewed the intelligence consider this the closest the world came to accidental nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, not because either side wanted war, but because one side believed the other had already decided on it. NATO commanders running the exercise had almost no idea any of this was happening. To them, November 1983 was an ordinary training week. The war scare unfolding in Moscow was invisible from the western side of the map. On November 11th, Able Archer 83 concluded exactly as scheduled. The simulated nuclear exchange ended on paper. Radios went quiet in the way exercises end, not the way wars do. Nothing had launched. Across the Warsaw Pact, alert levels stood down over the following days. Aircraft were unloaded. Pilots went back to ordinary rotations. On the surface, it looked as though nothing unusual had happened at all that November. NATO filed the exercise as a routine success. Communications tested, procedures validated, lessons logged for next year. No alarm was raised, because almost nobody on the Western side yet understood what had actually occurred. But Gordievsky's reporting kept arriving in London, describing a Soviet leadership that had genuinely, if briefly, believed the exercise might be real. British officials began to grasp that this had not been a false alarm on their end. It was real fear on the other. When the full picture reached Washington, It unsettled officials who had assumed Moscow could never seriously mistake a drill for an attack. The assumption of shared rationality between two nuclear powers had just failed a real test. By early 1984, President Reagan himself was briefed on how close the war scare had come. According to his own later writing, he was genuinely shaken, surprised that the Soviets could fear the United States as much as Washington feared them. Reagan's private diary from that period records a shift in his thinking, a recognition that decades of mutual suspicion had built a system where a training exercise could be mistaken, on either side, for the opening move of a war. Able Archer wasn't the only close call that autumn. Just weeks earlier, on September 26, 1983, a Soviet early warning satellite had wrongly reported incoming American missiles. Only one officer's judgment and his refusal to trust the alarm kept that moment from escalating. Two war scares in the same season, arriving from opposite directions, a false machine alarm inside the Soviet Union and a real training exercise misread as genuine, revealed how thin the margin for error had become by 1983. In 1990, the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board completed a classified review titled The Soviet War Scare, concluding that the danger in November 1983 had been more serious than almost anyone in government understood at the time. That report stayed sealed for 25 years. It was only declassified in 2015 after a Freedom of Information request from the National Security Archive, finally confirming in official language what Gordievsky had warned about in real time. Gordievsky himself defected to Britain in 1985, exfiltrated out of the Soviet Union in an operation run by M16 after Soviet counterintelligence began to close in on him. His later debriefings filled in the details historians still rely on today. The uncomfortable truth at the center of Able Archer 83 is this: an exercise built to rehearse how alliance leaders would communicate during a crisis very nearly manufactured the exact crisis it was designed only to simulate. It wasn't caused by aggression on either side. It was caused by perception, by two governments each so convinced of the other's hostile intentions that ordinary behavior, filtered through fear, started to look like preparation for war. That failure of perception is the real legacy of November 1983. Not a battle, not a launch, but a demonstration of how close two nuclear superpowers could come to catastrophe without either one intending it at all. In the years that followed, the war scare quietly reshaped Cold War diplomacy. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, both sides moved toward the kind of direct dialogue that produced the INF Treaty just 2 years later. Able Archer 83 is remembered today, when it's remembered at all, as a footnote, a training exercise with an odd Cold War name. It deserves to be remembered instead as the week the world nearly ended by accident. If a scheduling drill could push two superpowers this close to nuclear war without either one choosing it, the real lesson isn't about 1983. It's about how fragile the line between rehearsal and catastrophe still is. Subscribe to Edge of War for more.